The Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History presents Dr. Alan Guelzo, one of the nation's leading scholars on Abraham Lincoln. Dr. Guelzo discusses Lincoln the Philosopher with Dr. Michael Andrews.
Lincoln's political philosophy seems to have changed a great deal over time. As a young man, he seemed very much the Whiggish political thinker. In the 1850s, he seems to begin to appeal to natural rights with greater frequency. And then towards the end of the Civil War, particularly in his second inaugural, we find religious language appearing in his speeches, which is striking given that for most of Lincoln's life, he seemed to keep his distance from organized religion.
Well, I think that's true in the sense that Lincoln responds to the pressure of circumstances politically. And when you look at Lincoln early in his political career, he is very much the Whig political figure, and he's justifying his advocacy of Whig political philosophy very much on the basis of this is what is going to produce good practical results for the country. It's a very nuts and boltsy approach to the understanding of politics. This changes in the 50s, because in the 1850s, the issues themselves have begun to shift. Before the 1850s, Lincoln said that slavery was really not at the center of American political attention. This was not because slavery was unimportant in his mind, but because people believed that as a result of the Constitutional Convention and then the Compromise of 1820, that the slave issue was on its way to resolution, that slavery had been put in a place where Lincoln said it was on its way to ultimate extinction. And therefore, you didn't have to tamper with it. If it wasn't broke, don't fix it. So the compromises, the constitutional settlement, had taken slavery and put it in a place where it was eventually fading away under the duress of economics, under the ill logic of slavery compared to the principles of liberty, and to the fact that slavery was contained in an economic zone where eventually it would use up and exhaust the soils and the resources and would basically snuff out on its own, like a candle deprived of oxygen. In the 1850s, that changes, and it changes for two reasons. One is the Compromise of 1850, and then following on that, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. These appear to Lincoln, and in fact appear to anti-slavery people across the North, as opening up the floodgates of expansion for slavery. So the slavery which had been contained beforehand now was being given a free pass to move into the Western territories, and after the Dred Scott decision, it looked like all it would take would be one Supreme Court dictum, and even the free states would have all of their free state restrictions struck down.
Isn't that interesting, too? Because wasn't one of the implications of the Dred Scott decision is that freedom was a local phenomena and that slavery was potentially national?
Well, as far as the Dred Scott decision goes, yes, that was the effective result of it, because slavery, being defined very closely by Chief Justice Taney as a species of property, not as human beings. Slaves are not human beings, they're property. Define that as property, and that immediately puts that property under the Privileges and Immunities Clause and requires comity and recognition so that you cannot exclude an American citizen taking that quote-unquote property into the territories. So liberty is then set in opposition to property, which, strictly speaking, was never the view of the Constitution, but now is erected as this barrier to liberty. Lincoln responds to this by having to confront slavery head on in the 1850s. But to do that, he has to deal with this question of, well, isn't slavery property? How can you oppose slavery and not at the same time look like you're assaulting property rights? Mm-hmm. That is when Lincoln drops back and makes the appeal to natural law and natural rights. He said, if we were talking about what is usually defined as property, if we were talking about cranberry laws, or if we were talking even about livestock, then sure, protection of property, immunities and privileges, That should pertain to expansion of the territories as much as any other form of property. But since when do we define human beings, said Lincoln, as property? Human beings possess natural rights. The possession of those natural rights separates them from livestock, from cranberries, in a way which ought to be, as the Declaration of Independence says, self-evident. You don't need to prove that human beings have these natural rights. It's self-evident to anyone who hasn't deliberately blinded themselves. So to disarm this appeal to property, Lincoln will say, wait a minute, this is not property. These are human beings who have natural rights, and you can't violate that.
This has been a Jack Miller Center digital media presentation. For more information, visit thejackmillercenter.org.